Listen, this is not a story about policy papers or diplomatic note-passing. This is a story about time running out, about a map drawn in urgency and threat, and about millions of lives balanced on a single sentence, 3 or 4 days. When a world leader gives a one-line deadline, headlines harden into action. Promises become ultimatums. Plans become the last fragile bridge between a ceasefire and a catastrophic continuation of war. On September 29 to 30, 2025, the world watched as a dramatic, high-stakes proposal was unveiled in Washington, an apparent 20-point blueprint meant to halt a 2-year war that began with the October 7 attacks. The plan was presented at a joint appearance that included the U.S. leader and Israel's prime minister, a spectacle with teeth. The architecturally terse moment that followed was something the press would replay in slow motion, a deadline, and the threat that if Hamas did not accept harsher measures, those 2 lethal words would follow. The language was blunt: accept the plan, or face consequences. What was in the plan? In public reporting, the proposal has been described as a 20-point package that demanded disarmament of Hamas, the release of hostages within short windows, and a transitional governance arrangement for Gaza that specifically excludes Hamas and the Palestinian Authority from any future governing role. It includes a staged, conditional Israeli withdrawal tied to security guarantees and to the return of hostages, and a controversial international supervisory role, which some reports say would include a new Board of Peace and external figures in temporary governance. Tony Blair's name surfaced publicly in reporting as one of the figures associated with a proposed technocratic transitional mechanism, a detail that inflamed critics and supporters alike because it put an ex-prime minister in the seat of an international manager for Gaza. Those elements, disarmament, hostage release deadlines, transitional governance without Hamas, make the proposal a hinge. It promises relief for some who demand hostages return quickly, while demanding political annihilation of Hamas as a governing entity. And then came the voice from the United Nations stage. Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, spoke at a memorial event marking the 2nd anniversary of the October 7 attack. He did not mince words. If they reject the plan, Israel will finish the job, either the easy way or the hard way, Danon said. Those words were not a figure of speech for diplomats, they were a conditional promise that read like a threat and a timetable all at once: accept and there may be a negotiated end, refuse and the war resumes in a different, possibly more decisive form. For families of hostages and for Israelis who have lived in the shadow of those 250-plus days of war and trauma, the line was meant as certainty: we will bring them back, no matter the cost. For Palestinians and many international observers, the line tasted like a final warning and a license. We must step back and breathe in the context. This is not happening in a vacuum. Gaza has been a cauldron for 2 years by this point, an enclave devastated by intensive conflict, with colossal civilian casualties, mass displacement, starving pockets and a breakdown of basic infrastructure. International aid convoys have been stymied by logistics and politics. The humanitarian markers are stark: hospitals running on the skeletons of supply chains, children in malnourished clinics, entire neighborhoods gone from maps. In this landscape, any plan that promises a route to hostages and an end to active combat will gather urgent supporters. At the same time, any plan that demands that a group like Hamas be stripped of political power and arms, with little or no Palestinian role in deciding the future of Gaza, will generate fierce rejection and claims that. This is the paradox at the heart of the peace plan, a narrow funnel to bring people home that also forces a monumental political change on the ground. So what does it mean to issue a deadline? Deadlines compress improvisation into binary choice. For Hamas, which is both a political movement and a military network operating amid highly constrained communication with external mediators, a 3 or 4 day deadline is not only short, it is violently short. For mediators, for Qatar and Egypt traditionally involved, and for United Nations actors concerned with prisoners and civilians, the deadline became a pressure valve. For coalition politics in Israel, and for the parties backing the plan in Washington, it became the performative moment: act now, or be blamed later. For the people living in Gaza, civilians, aid workers, people sheltering in makeshift tent cities, the deadline is a legalistic fiction. it does not change where food, water, shelter, or medicine will come from. It only changes the calculus of commanders. But the plan's legalistic details, required disarmament, rapid hostage release, and the exclusion of Hamas from governance, reveal a fundamental tension. The plan promises humanitarian assistance and phases of withdrawal, but only in exchange for concessions that Hamas has historically refused to consider, formalized disarmament and relinquishment of any political claim. From the Israeli point of view, the logic is brutal and simple: dismantle the organization that carried out atrocities, remove its ability to rule and rearm, secure the border, and return hostages. From Hamas's perspective, to accept such a deal would be to admit political defeat, to accept conditions imposed without Palestinian consent, and to have the future of Gaza determined by external actors rather than its own people. This is not just negotiation, it is a forced rewriting of political home rule. That is why the rhetoric around "finish the job" cut through so violently. It framed the choice in the language of irreversible consequences. When the dust settles on the rhetorical fireworks, practical questions remain: who enforces the conditions? Who administers aid and reconstruction? What guarantees exist to protect returning civilians from reprisals? How would a demilitarized Gaza work logistically while the machine of belligerence still hums across borders and in the minds of combatants? These worries are not academic, they'll determine whether the plan de-escalates or detonates further violence. And they force the moral question into the operational one: do we prioritize immediate hostage returns and stop the act of killing now, or do we refuse a coercive plan that may deepen structural injustice and leave unresolved political grievances? There is no clean answer, only the messy arithmetic of survival and of politics, and the urgent human arithmetic of the hostage families. This script will trace the arc of that moment: the unveiling in Washington, the words at the UN, the deadlines, the reaction, the likely scenarios, and the undercurrent of human cost. We will explore how a plan can sometimes be a ladder out of war for some, and a trapdoor into deeper dispossession for others. We will examine motives and misgivings. We will look at the players, from leaders to hostage families, to international mediators, to civilians on the streets of Gaza, and listen to what they fear, what they hope for, and what will happen next if the proposal is embraced, if it's rejected, or if it's stalled in the fog of politics. According to the public outlines in multiple outlets, the plan is structured around immediate security and humanitarian objectives married to a political reset. The core demands include the disarmament of Hamas, the immediate and verifiable release of hostages within tight timelines, concrete guarantees for the demilitarization of Gaza, an interim, technocratic governance structure to manage Gaza's transition, and an eventual phased withdrawal of Israeli forces tied to the fulfillment of those security conditions. International actors, from the U.S. executive and some allied states, are presented as guarantors of the transitional governance. This is a classic trade: security for sovereignty, or at least security for a transition that leaves sovereign questions unresolved. Many international comments point out that the plan as announced bypassed Palestinian participation in the formulation stage, which has exacerbated suspicions about its impartiality. The inclusion of high-profile international figures in the proposal's supervisory architecture, the name Tony Blair is frequently reported, is a lightning rod. To supporters, an experienced international politician with relationships across diplomatic circles can offer managerial credibility and accelerate reconstruction. To detractors, Blair's involvement signals foreign imposition and recalls past grievances about technocratic interventions that ignored popular Palestinian political aspirations. Blair's name, in effect, transforms a technical detail into a symbolic one. Is Gaza's future a matter for a technocratic board or for an empowered Palestinian polity? That rhetorical question matters, because symbolic ownership is often a door to legitimacy or a match to kindle rejection. On the day the plan was announced, President Trump's public statements underlined the ultimatum. He told reporters that Hamas had about 3 or 4 days to accept the proposal and that failure to do so would bring severe consequences. He used language meant to compress the window for diplomacy and to signal backup options if the immediate demand failed. Political leaders often use deadlines as leverage, to force a negotiating partner out of indecision and onto a binary track, but in the middle of an active war, compressed windows risk catalyzing further violence rather than tempering it. The U.S. framing was not only about policy, it was a rhetorical device that sought to shift blame for a failed process. This move reoriented responsibility. The plan's authors could say, "We offered a route out, if it's rejected, the rejection is on them." Whether this rhetorical framing will calm or inflame the situation is the essential next question. Let's look at immediate reactions. Many Western and regional governments greeted the plan with cautious relief, rejoicing in prospects of hostages freed and the chance of an end to active combat. Several Arab states and other nations signaled some measure of support or at least open engagement, seeing an opportunity to stop mass suffering and stabilize a region under strain. At the same time, European envoys and rights organizations raised alarms, warning that a framework which ignores Palestinian political agency risks institutionalizing dispossession. The United Nations and international NGOs posed urgent logistics questions. How will humanitarian corridors be protected? Who will provide the armor-plated guarantees that convoys need to move? The humanitarian calculus is blunt and quantifiable. Food, fuel, medicine and clean water need secure routes, health facilities require staff and supplies, rebuilding needs cash and controlled access. Those are not abstract requirements, they will decide how many survive the next 6 months. Now, the Israeli angle. Israel's political theater is complex. On one side, hostage families and broad swathes of the Israeli public and politicians demanded answers, "Bring our people home." To them, any credible plan that offers a realistic route to the immediate return of hostages is worth backing. On the other side are far-right ministers and factions inside Israel's own governing coalition who see the plan as either too constraining or as a cover to preserve long-term control over territory that they prefer remain under firm security control. Prime Minister Netanyahu's public posture, accepting the plan under certain conditions, reflects the political tightrope, a partial public embrace that keeps the coalition intact while publicly insisting on caveats and operational latitude. There's a political bargain embedded here. Accept the plan's public optics while preserving legal and operational options to continue forceful measures if necessary. That tension explains why Israeli leaders used phrasing like, "We will do what we must," and why Danon's "finish the job" comment carries such weight. And the message to Hamas is unmistakable: you have a choice that includes rapid humanitarian relief and the return of captives, but the price is steep. From Western capitals, that message is presented as pragmatic, an immediate end to killing and a path to rebuilding. From the perspective of Palestinian political legitimacy, however, it is coercive. The plan prescribes Gaza's political fate without giving Gaza's main political actors a seat at the table. For many Palestinians, and for sympathizers across the region, the plan reads as an ultimatum dressed up as an offer: take it or see renewed military action that could finish entrenched resistance as an organizing political force. That is why analysis across the region is bifurcated. Some see a risky but necessary step to stop carnage, others see a recipe for more dispossession. Let's listen to the hostage families who have been central to this debate. Their heartbreak and their demand for action cannot be overstated. 2 years of uncertainty, delayed information, and daily grief has hardened public opinion in Israel. Many Israelis see retrieval of hostages as a moral and immediate obligation that supersedes complex. The psychology there is understandable. The families are not asking for negotiators to bargain over the ethics of sovereignty, they ask for the bodies and the living relatives returned safely. To those families, Danon's phrase, "the easy way or the hard way," is an expression of adamant national responsibility. But national responsibility expressed in kinetic terms risks creating more civilian harm in Gaza, harm that will echo for generations. This inescapable moral collision, the urgent pull of hostage return versus long-term political rights of Palestinians, is the engine of the crisis. In this chunk we must also consider the mechanism of enforcement. If Hamas were to accept, how would disarmament be monitored? Who would conduct verification? Which international actors would deploy observers and police to maintain the ceasefire while the political architecture is arranged? The plan's reliance on a transitional board and external supervisors answers part of the question, but not the most critical one: who controls the guns at the first sign of breakdown? The historical skepticism toward third-party governance in the Middle East is strong because past experiments have often lacked teeth or impartiality. That skepticism makes acceptance politically costly for any Palestinian actor. It risks losing public legitimacy and invites violent splintering if factions refuse to disarm. The plan's architects hope the lure of resources and the promise of security guarantees offset the political cost. Whether that trade will hold in practice remains the open question of this proposal's viability. Finally, consider the rhetorical theater, the deadline, the international figures, the UN stage, and the rhetoric of "finish the job." Words are used to shape the battlefield as much as bullets. They create legal cover, shift blame, and attempt to crystallize the narrative. But narratives do not bind conflicts that are lived in blood and rubble. They can move international public opinion and stiffen domestic support, but at the end of the day, it is forces on the ground and supply lines for the wounded and hungry that determine whether a plan stops the fighting or simply resets it. We're now entering the part of the story where consequences will branch into multiple scenarios: acceptance and fragile peace, rejection and resumed large-scale hostilities, or a prolonged standoff that degrades into frozen conflict. The next chunk will explore those possible scenarios and their human and geopolitical costs. We now step into scenarios, the probable futures that unspool from a decision to accept, reject, or stall. Each path has its own gravity. Each path will leave footprints on the map, and scars in bodies and memories. Scenario 1, Hamas accepts the proposal, conditionally or fully. Acceptance would likely trigger an immediate diplomatic scramble for verification, hostage handovers, and the first concrete flows of humanitarian assistance in months. International actors would deploy observers and begin the politically sensitive work of building the transitional authority envisaged in the plan. For families who have asked for immediate returns, the relief would be profound. For some Gaza civilians, a pause in active hostilities would mean a narrow window for food and medicine to enter devastated hospitals and for displaced families to reassess their futures. Yet acceptance would also be contentious. Hamas acceptance would require signaling internal control and discipline among armed brigades, something that could fracture under pressure. Acceptance without broad Palestinian political buy-in could produce splinters and violent spoilers. Smaller groups or rogue commanders could refuse to disarm and the transitional government would face immediate tests. The transitional authority would need robust protection and legitimacy, otherwise it would be labeled a foreign imposition and sabotage inevitable. Acceptance, therefore, could lead either to the fragile opening of a humanitarian window or to a fast collapse into renewed asymmetric warfare if enforcement mechanisms falter. Scenario 2, Hamas rejects the plan. This is the path that the Israeli envoy's words were aimed to influence. Rejection could be immediate for reasons both practical and symbolic. The plan strips political choice, counts on external technocrats, and offers no direct pathway to Palestinian statehood or sovereignty in the immediate term. A public rejection would provide legal cover for Israeli forces and their political backers to resume or intensify offensive operations with an eye toward what some leaders call finishing the job. In the immediate political logic described by Israeli officials, finishing the job could mean renewed major operations aimed at dismantling Hamas military capacity and seizing territory to ensure long-term security. That language carries enormous risk. It threatens not only the tactical recalibration of the battlefield, but a wider humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, already reduced to skeletal infrastructure. Scenario 3, the plan is provisionally accepted, debated, or stalled in a diplomatic limbo. This is perhaps the most likely on the first pass. Hamas may publicly state that it is studying the plan or awaiting clarifications relayed via mediators like Qatar and Egypt. In such a slow burn, neither side is ready to declare victory. International mediators will attempt to extend deadlines, negotiate technical verifications, and arrange staged confidence measures such as partial hostage releases in exchange for humanitarian corridors. But the longer the limbo, the more likely the situation becomes a new status quo where violence, blockades, and humanitarian scarcity continue, and where political energy dissipates into negotiation fatigue. For civilians, a diplomatic limbo is an extended sentence: food runs out, disease spreads, and infrastructure erodes. Politically, a limbo invites spoilers on all sides. Let's examine the actors who would be decisive in each scenario. First, Qatar and Egypt. Historically, both states have acted as back-channel mediators, shuttling messages and terms between Hamas, Israel, and other stakeholders. Their role now is pivotal. They can offer face-saving mechanisms that allow both sides to claim gains without public humiliation. If Hamas accepts in private but frames it as a step in a broader Palestinian strategy, mediators could shepherd a partial implementation. Conversely, if mediators are excluded from final decisions or cannot provide guarantees, for example, safe movement or credible enforcement observers, then their influence collapses. That mismatch is crucial. The plan's success may rest less on the text of the deal than on the willingness of regional players to buy into and protect the mechanics of a transition. Second, the international guarantors. If the plan depends on an international board or technocratic supervisory body, the credibility and capacity of those guarantors will define the early success or failure. Will they deploy observers with real authority? Will they be willing to confront spoilers that try to scuttle the deal? If those international actors are seen as proxies for one side, or seen as lacking teeth, the plan's legitimacy will evaporate on contact with spoilers and skeptics. The Blair-style technocrat may work as an interim manager for reconstruction funds and administrative tasks, but without genuine local ownership, managerial competence alone cannot pacify politics. Third, the domestic politics inside Israel and within Palestinian politics. On the Israeli side, both public pressure and coalition calculations will determine how forcefully leaders pursue their expressed options. Hostage families and parts of the electorate will demand results. Far-right ministers may push for continued territorial control. On the Palestinian side, Hamas internal cohesion, the role of other factions, popular sentiment in Gaza, and the stance of the Palestinian Authority will all shape whether an agreement becomes durable or is ripped apart by internal dissent. These factors make the political calculus volatile. Even a technically sophisticated plan can fail if domestic political incentives push leaders toward maximalist positions. Fourth, the humanitarian organizations and the UN. These actors are the immediate lifeline to civilians. Their ability to operate safely depends on a credible security environment. If the plan opens pathways for sustained corridors, then aid flows could reduce the human toll in the immediate term. If not, the humanitarian picture will worsen, with shortages of water, fuel, and medicine already at acute levels. For those on the ground, the abstract debates on governance are subordinate to the practical question: will aid trucks reach the hospitals? The answer there will define survival in the weeks ahead. Now think of the psychological impact of Dannon's phrasing, the easy way or the hard way, line and the vow to finish the job. Words like that do more than declare intent, they provide a script for soldiers, for commanders, for the public. They may harden resolve among those who support forceful action. They will terrify Gaza civilians and could prompt mass movements of people trying to escape in fear of intensified campaigns. Human behavior under threat is predictable: people flee, they cram into perceived safe zones, they strain limited water and sanitation, and disease follows. So the moral consequences cascade quickly from rhetoric to refugee flows to disease to regional instability. That chain is short, it does not require direct military escalation to be triggered. There are also international legal questions that merit attention. Disarmament and transitional governance measures raise complicated queries about occupation law, sovereignty, and the rights of civilians under international humanitarian law. If a state imposes sweeping governance changes without local consent, legal scholars and human rights groups will challenge such moves in courts, international bodies, and public forums. Those legal fires can complicate the implementation of any deal by creating parallel legitimacy crises. In short, even if the plan is enacted de facto, it may be contested de jure in ways that prolong instability. Finally, the geopolitical ripple effects. The Middle East is not isolated. Neighboring states, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran's regional posture, and global power competition will react. If the plan is seen as a unilateral victory for one side, regional actors sympathetic to the other side may shift from diplomatic protest to material support for armed groups. If the plan reduces violence credibly, it might open constrained room for regional diplomacy. But the margin for error is small. Missteps can expand from Gaza to Lebanon, the West Bank, and beyond. This is why the articulation of an end to conflict must be both technical and politically elegant, and why, realistically, achieving such elegance is exceedingly difficult.